Okay, welcome back. So today we're going to talk about the art of China. As you probably know, we're getting near the end of the semester, so we'll do our best to get through as much material as possible. But under these times, we may have to skip a little bit. If so, we may have to reduce sections on Islam. Just keep a watch here. We'll have a couple of lectures posted today, and then hopefully a couple of lectures posted a week from today. But we'll see how this goes. Okay, so let's talk about China. So first of all, China is really defined by its geography. Just to kind of orient you, this is a kind of topographical map of China, and this has the modern boundaries of China. So up here we have the Gobi Desert, which kind of defines China to the north, this large mountainous region here. We have the western deserts. We have the Tibetan Plateau, which is in here. But the central area that's going to be China is this area right here. This is the area of the Han ethnic culture. This is where the Yellow River is located, the Huang River. There is, of course, a bunch of this chunk up here that would be later what we call Manchuria. And then we have the southern regions of China down here. But this is really the heartland of China. And this is where we find historical China. So here you can see that this is where the Shang dynasty and the Zhou dynasty, the first actual imperial dynasty, the Qin dynasty is the dark green and extends out this way, and then the Han dynasty, which extends all the way out to the western desert. Notice that Tibet does not come into the Chinese Empire until much later. China is a very diverse geographic region. Of course, it has deserts. It has plains to the north and deserts to the west. But the heartland of China is very rich. It's an incredibly rich area with lots of resources and lots of agricultural wealth. And of course, they discovered rice very early on. So rice becomes the foundational agricultural product. And this allows for the creation of very large populations. There's a reason why China has a very large population today. It's because it had a very large population anciently. And so they had all of these rivers and all of these rice and millet production that allowed to have very large populations. And if you have large populations, that means you have a lot of economic activity. And this was where we get into the Silk Road. This is the defining major economic impetus for China. So while China is located in the heartlands of the Yellow River, the Huang River in this area, it had a number of high-end luxury group objects that it was producing. The first and foremost, of course, is silk. Silk was a mysterious material to people of the West. Many didn't know that it was made from silkworms and the cocoons of silkworms. They thought it was actually made from a plant. Pliny describes the production of silk, and it's obvious he has no idea what he's talking about. So silk was a very closely guarded secret, and they would send silk on the Silk Road, and it would either go over or under the Tajik Desert, and then around the Himalayas into what is Persia until eventually it reached the eastern Mediterranean. They also had, of course, high-quality ceramics, lacquerware, spices. So you have this kind of economic disparity that develops. China has a lot of high-end luxury goods, but those luxury goods are consumable. They're things like spices, silk wears out, etc., porcelain breaks, and they were trading for things like gold and silver and other materials which were very, very valuable, but didn't wear out. And so this actually impoverished the West and enriched China to a great deal. And so the economic displacement of China in the ancient world is vast. The Han Empire is easily as big as the Roman Empire, and probably in terms of economics, it's probably 3 or 4 times as big as the Roman Empire. So China is a very impressive place. So this Silk Road and this imbalance in trade, where they were trading kind of consumable luxury goods for gold and silver, really vastly enriches China. So Chinese chronology is extraordinarily complex. It has a number of very ancient civilizations, but we're going to kind of simplify it here for you today. We're going to start with the ancient period, and the ancient period is the period prior to the imperial period. China has about 5,000 years of recorded history. The first 2,500 is more mytho-historical. That is, some of it is reliable, some of it is not. We have some early Neolithic cultures that come in 10,000 BC, and then we have dynasties like Xia dynasty and the Shang dynasty. The Xia dynasty is more mythological than it is historical, and it's hard to verify any of the dates in there. As we get to the Shang dynasty, it's obvious that some of this is true. It's the Zhou dynasty where we actually enter into the historical period. And the Zhou, or sometimes the Chao dynasty, these are going to be historical periods. This is where you have the rise of Taoism, Confucianism, all of these ideas. This is where Buddhism is first introduced, etc. And this is the cultural era that really starts to create China as we know it. The next period is the imperial period, and the imperial period is unified China. Up until this point, China had not been unified into a single entity. There were many different kingdoms that fought with each other, and while the ideas and culture of China were being developed in the Zhou dynasty, it's not until the Qin dynasty that it's unified together. And so this is why we call it China, because it's first unified under the Qin dynasty. So the Qin dynasty is the first, but then we have a whole series of dynasties. That is, a ruling family or a ruling class comes to power. When it's replaced by a new ruling dynasty, that makes a new period of dynasty. Now, this is grossly oversimplified. I hope you realize these are just the highlights. So after the establishment of the Qin dynasty, which really kind of makes China China, we then have the Han dynasty. The Han dynasty, Han is the term for ethnic Chinese. That's what they call themselves. This is the ethnic Chinese of the Yellow River area and the heartlands of China. And they really establish what we would regard as kind of classic Chinese civilization. A very long empire, lasts for 400 years. It collapses, and then this is the pattern in China, that we move from a period of centralized control, empire, and then it collapses and it goes to a period of disunity, and you have these warring kingdoms or multiple dynasties. Then as we pick up in the 6th through the 13th century, we have a series of dynasties: the Sui dynasty, the Tang dynasty, the Song dynasty. And there is some disunity at various times, but we have these long-lasting dynasties that have incredible artistic production and very amazing works of art in painting. We have improvements in poetry, painting, architecture, all kinds of styles. And this really is kind of the high point of China. Then we have this kind of strange period known as the Yuan dynasty. The Yuan dynasty is the Mongols. The Mongols come in and change the world. They change it in Islam, they change it in Poland, they change it everywhere. And so you actually have a period where the Mongols are ruling China. This is not a period that the Chinese much care for. But this actually expands the power and influence of Chinese culture and brings a lot of Chinese influence to the West and to the Muslim world as well, and into Persia. Then you have the ethnic Han people reasserting themselves, and then we get into what's known as the early modern period or the late period. The Ming dynasty is the reassertion of Han ethnic rule. That lasts up until the 17th century. And then finally we have the Qing dynasty, which is Manchu. This is the Manchurians who are coming down. So let's talk about some cultural practices that are very old practices that give us a sense of what Chinese culture is like. The first is that we need to talk about Chinese traditional religion or Chinese traditional beliefs. It's important to note that long before the introduction of Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, there was a whole series of native beliefs, the most important of which is a wide pantheon of deities. There is a kind of supreme creator god known as the Emperor of Heaven, sometimes known as the Jade Emperor, and there's a vast pantheon of figures underneath him, but there are many, many local and animistic deities. There are deities, by animistic I mean deities for rivers, for forests, for mountains, etc. And all of these were venerated. So while there is a kind of chief creator deity, it's a very, very pluralistic society with many diverse traditions. One of the biggest traditions, however, is ancestor worship, that you see the veneration of ancestors. And the belief is that many of these ancestors, many of these prominent ancestors, go on to kind of be gods and are worshipped as protectors either of the family or of the dynasty, or sometimes whole villages or sometimes whole regions. Another really prominent idea is the ideas of dualism and geomancy. So here you see individual offerings on a modern grave. So this is something that continues to this day. So here we have fruits and other offerings, as well as candles and incense being offered to an ancestor. We see ancestral shrines in homes in modern China. Here is an ancestral shrine in a local area. And it's very important that you propitiate these ancestors. One of my favorite traditions is this concept of spirit money. Ancestors need money. The Chinese invented paper money. They were the first to print paper money. And so this is spirit money, money that can't be used to buy anything in this world, but you burn it and you pass it on to your ancestors. And some of these modern traditions will even make whole Mercedes or very fancy cars out of paper and burn them, and by burning them it moves them on to their ancestors. So this is still a very prominent practice, but this is one of the defining characteristics of Chinese traditional religion. One of the other features of it is dualism or geomancy. I'm sure you've seen this symbol before. This is the yin-yang, which literally means dark light. And it suggests that all nature is in a state of balance, and that there are a series of naturally opposing pairs in nature, like male, female, dark, light, mountain, and ocean. And one of the things I didn't really get about this until I started studying Japanese gardens — Japanese gardens are in fact based on Chinese gardens — is that this imbues Chinese people and most Asian people with a natural veneration and respect for nature, that the natural order is the way things are supposed to be. And so when you make a garden, you do not make it into a geometric pattern the way that, say, a Persian or a French garden might be made, that represents this kind of ordered universe. You show it as a natural garden. You take pains to elevate natural forms and to not make things look artificial. And so there's this belief that there's a natural order and harmony in the universe. It's important to note that even something like yin and yang are not regarded as clear and distinct. For example, yin, which is dark, but also represents the kind of female element, and can represent kind of destruction, also has yang in it. It has light in it. That pure yin and pure yang do not exist. That yin and yang also have a little bit of yang and yin in them. It's just that one is more ascendant while the other one is retreating. And so you see the world as a series of balancing forces. And it's very important to realize that, yin and yang don't mean good and evil. Good is the balance of these forces in harmony, and evil is the imbalance of these forces. This strongly impacts Chinese notions of divination. This is a typical kind of divination compass used in practices such as feng shui, etc. And this goes back all the way to one of the oldest books, one of the classical books in Chinese philosophy, which is the I Ching. And the I Ching is a book on divination, and it was written during the Zhou dynasty. And it requires you to kind of order the universe. There is a spirit animal associated with every one of the cardinal directions. I'm currently building a Japanese garden in my house, and one of the things is that if you build a Japanese garden, you have to have a path and a gate to the south. This is, again, all borrowed from Chinese ideas, because the white tiger spirit needs access to get out of that region. And so you need to have something flow. There is this sense of this universal pervasive energy, which is called qi, that all things have, and the interruption of qi causes bad things to happen. So you would never do something like not put a gate on the south side of a garden. If you have on the north side, you should have a mountain. I think a spirit animal for the mountain is a black tortoise. And on the south side, you should have water, and the spirit animal there is a blue dragon. And so these things work in opposition to each other. If you have a tall rock on one side, you're not going to put a tall rock next to it in the garden. You're going to put a shorter rock. And you're going to try to make it appear natural, to create a kind of microcosm what you're seeing. And so a lot of life is ordered this way, and to the belief that you do not impede qi, this natural spiritual energy. It must flow. So these ideas greatly impact the arts, because this sense of balance and harmony found in nature, if it exists in gardens, it has to exist in arts, it has to exist in society, it has to exist in natural medicine, acupuncture, and traditional Chinese medicine, and everything else. The Chinese also have long-standing rational philosophies. So while a lot of these philosophies about ancestor worship and the many different pantheons of gods, and also on dualism and geomancy, well, those are rooted more in mystical or religious traditions. There's also rational traditions. And by rational traditions, I mean logical traditions about politics, philosophy, how we understand the world. And the most important individual here is known as Confucius in the West, but he's known as Kongzhu in the East. And Kongzhu was a minister. He was a minister in the Lu ducal state, but eventually ended up being exiled because of the political machinations of the state. And he wound up in exile, gathering a number of disciples and writing a series of works, the most important of which is the Analects. And he creates a kind of ethical philosophy. It's interesting that in the works of Confucius, we have a kind of restatement of what the West would recognize as the Golden Rule, where he says, never impose on others what you would not choose for yourself. He also talks about epistemology. Epistemology is the study of how do we know what we know. And he argues that you look for truth in facts. And he also has this very complex philosophy about the rectification of names, where he says that basically, in a nutshell, and I'm really oversimplifying this, that if rulers engage in doublespeak, if they don't see things as they really are, and don't engage with facts and reality, and they bend words semantically to suit their purposes, ultimately this is going to cause disunity in the state, because people are going to see that reality does not line up with the fiction, with the words or the semantics being employed by the ruler, and so they will have to rectify the names. They will have to make things correct again. It's funny because Confucius comes across as a purveyor of fortune cookie proverbs in the West, but he really was an exceptionally deep thinker, an exceptionally rational thinker. He doesn't speak much about religious items. In fact, towards the end of his life, his disciples said, well, what about God? What about the afterlife? And he says, it's all I can do to manage with just understanding how to live an ethical life and how to determine how to live an ethical state. So the big focus of Confucius's ethical and political philosophy is familial piety and duty. And what he means by that is that society should be structured like the family. This is what we in the West kind of call the social contract, that future generations owe something to the past, and the past, current generations owe something to the future. That is, you can't just pillage the future for the sake of the now. There is a social contract. There's a social contract between elites at the top and people at the bottom who are workers who are creating everything. And he saw the best social contract as one that was based on a patriarchal social order. That is, you should think of all of China as a single family. The emperor then is a father figure. He is the paternal patron of everybody. But there are limits placed on the emperor. If you are a father in a family, you can't just beat your children indiscriminately, because if you do, they'll hate you, and they'll overthrow you, and they'll kill you, and that's bad. So you may need to punish them from time to time, but you also have to feed them, you also have to teach them, you also have to love them. And so there's a social contract implicit in the patriarchal order. And so his argument was that the emperor acts as the father figure for the entire state. But he doesn't get to indiscriminately beat his children and his subjects. He must look out for their benefit, for their education, for their improvement, as a loving father would. And this puts very strict limits on the emperor on what he can and cannot do. And therefore, there's this development of this concept called the mandate of heaven. That is that an emperor who is prospering his people, an emperor who is helping his people, and who is loved by his people, is said to have the mandate of heaven. That is, that everything is going well, therefore heaven, the Jade Emperor, and all of the universe in China. China is imagined as the middle kingdom. There is the upper kingdom, which is the heavens, and there's the lower kingdom, which is the underworld. So China is the middle kingdom. It is the realm of mortals. So the middle kingdom is under the mandate of heaven. That means that everything is as it should. But of course, if there's famine, if there's war, if there's political strife, if there's corruption, this is evidence that the ruler doesn't have the mandate of heaven. And so implicit in Chinese civilization is this idea that if your rulers aren't doing it for you, you have the right to overthrow them. Which is funny, because we think of it as a very authoritarian structure in the ancient world in China, and it was. You know, if the father is doing good things, you pretty much have to accept his rule. But if he's not, and this is why you have breakdowns in Chinese dynasties, and you have these warring periods that exist. Now, that's interesting that this philosophy was not universally accepted. In fact, the first emperor, and this is him right here, Qin Shua Hongdi, this guy here, the first Chinese emperor actually banned Confucius philosophy because it put limits on the emperor. He wanted to rule as an absolute autocrat and dictator, and he didn't want to have any limits on his rule. And so he actually banned Confucius philosophy, and he actually burned the books of Confucius philosophy. But those books were preserved, and the memories of Confucian scholars, and when the Han Dynasty came to power, they adopted this as the official political philosophy of China, and it's pretty much been the political philosophy of China right up until about 1912, when the first Chinese Republic started, and they ended the imperial system. It's very important to know that it's a rational philosophy, that there are clear benchmarks by which you can mark the progress of something. But it does have this strict nested hierarchical social order. There should be deference and adherence to superiors and elders. So if your ruler is doing something in your self-interest, you don't really get to complain. And it also emphasizes elaborate social custom and protocol, that, there are very, very strict protocols about what you can do and what you cannot do, and it keeps this order in place. But one of the more interesting wrinkles that emerges out of this is the concept of meritocracy and civil service. This is something that begins in the Zhou dynasty and continues right up until the very end of the Chinese Empire, which is this belief that in order to have this rational society, you have to have the very, very best people, the smartest people, the most educated people, and to be this. And so there was a civil service examination from the times of the Han Dynasty onward, where if you could pass this examination and prove you could read and write and understood poetry and philosophy and culture and all these things, you could be elevated to be a magistrate. Now, naturally, people who were already educated had advantages, but there are plenty of stories in Chinese history of ordinary peasants or their children studying in private to take this examination, who went and took this examination, and because they were so dang smart and well-read, they went on to become some of the highest-ranking magistrates and civil servants in China. So, at times it only rewarded privilege. It's like any system. Our system, unfortunately, is supposed to be a meritocracy too, But, you know, the problem with the meritocracy is that not everybody starts from the same position. Some people start from a position of political connection, privilege, etc., and some people start from nothing. But at least in theory, this promoted the most able people. And so if you were a peasant in China, unlike if you were an untouchable in India, you could accelerate to the highest levels of government office. And it did happen. Probably not as much as it should have, but it did happen. The next major philosophical tradition that we need to talk about is Taoism. In China, there are 3 philosophical ideas that are called the 3 doctrines. And the first is Confucianism, and the third one is Buddhism, but the second is Taoism. Taoism is a native religion, although I hesitate to call it a religion because there are no religious requirements of Taoism. If you wanted to be, you could be a Taoist. Taoist makes no kind of religious faith claims in a way that, say, even Buddhism does. So if you wanted to be, you could be a Taoist and be a Catholic, or a Taoist and a Jew or Mormon or whatever. Lao Tzu was a individual. Here's a picture of him riding an ox, who presumably was born sometime in the 6th century BCE. And he wrote a book called the Tao Te Ching, which is again one of these great classical works of Chinese philosophy. And in it, he extols what's known as the way, and that's the Tao. But this could also, it means literally path, like way, like road, but it could also mean reason, order, kind of justifying or animating principle of the universe. It's an extremely difficult philosophy to understand. In fact, the most frustrating thing about reading the Tao Te Ching, which is a very short book, but when you read it, it says the first line is, "The way that can be named is not the true way." So you're like, wait a minute, how can I understand this thing called Taoism if I can't even name what the true way is? So basically what it comes down to is a kind of mystical understanding of the universe based on intuition or spiritual intuition or mystical understanding. There is an order to the universe, a kind of built-in path that everything must follow. And to break away from the path causes disorder, strife, and a lack of ability. That is, that if you go against this way, not only do you cause disorder, but you cause disharmony in your own life, but it decreases your own skill and your ability to function in the universe. And so you must accept the way. You must surrender to the way. And you must, not question it, but learn to listen to it, this kind of natural law or order that exists in the universe. One of the main themes about it is this thing called the 10,000 things. One of my favorite lines out of the Tao Te Ching is he says that, when you find the way, the 10,000 things will take care of themselves. And 10,000 things is a metaphor for all of the distractions of life that we think are important. All of the things that we think are important in life, the 10,000 things, your job, your life, your career, the harvest, whatever it may be, that we concentrate on those thinking that if we take care of this will solve the problem. And the answer is no. What you need to do is find the Tao. You need to find the way. And if you find the way, the 10,000 things will take care of themselves. That is, that the natural order of the universe will reveal itself to you, and you can follow it. There's also this, idea of accepting emptiness, of accepting nothingness. That there's this wonderful phrase in the Tao Te Ching that says, it is, you look at a vessel and the vessel's beautiful, but the vessel is only useful because of the emptiness inside. A vessel is used to hold liquid. It's used to hold, wine or food or whatever it is. But it's the emptiness that makes it useful. And you should learn to accept your own nothingness or your own emptiness. You empty yourself out. So this is a way of getting rid of all your delusions, your false preconceptions, and to accept the Tao. And if you do, in Taoist philosophy, now Taoism accepts the existence of gods and supernatural beings. Those aren't necessarily essential to it, but yeah, they exist, so what? And it also argues that if you accept this nothingness, and the path of Taoism is opened up to you, you can do supernatural things. So if you've ever seen those kung fu movies where the kung fu fighters can fly or jump incredible distances or do amazing things, this is this idea, this of Taoism, that if you know the true way, if you can see the true way, and you follow the universe and accept your own nothingness, then this will be open to you. But again, you surrender your own will to the way, to the natural order of the universe. Now, this is similar to Buddhism in a way, and so it was very, very influential on Buddhism, particularly Chan or Zen Buddhism. Chan is a Chinese variety of Buddhism. Zen Buddhism is a Japanese variety of Buddhism. But it was also very interesting on Confucian scholars, because remember, Confucianism deals with the world as it is. It deals with the real politic world of ethics and politics and reality, and how do we understand the universe. Confucianism is very Aristotelian in a way of understanding the world, but Taoism is much more like Neoplatonic thought or Stoic thought in a way of how do we understand or deal with the universe in a moral fashion. And so what's interesting is that many Confucian scholars were in fact only Confucian in their public life, and in their private life they were secretly Taoists, that Taoism gave them deep spiritual meaning. Okay. There's so much more we could talk about either Confucianism or Taoism, but I got to move on. So what does this mean for art? Well, if Confucianism gives order and reason to the universe, it impacts art in that way, that the world should be an orderly universe, it should be applied by logic, etc. And so you will see Confucian principles in art and architecture and design. But Taoism pushes back in the opposite direction, towards the organic, towards the natural. And so when you see works of art such as this Ming Dynasty period, the Dragon Pine by Wu Bo-li, there is this love of natural forms. That a tree or a river are often used as metaphors in Taoism for following the way. You know, a tree doesn't determine the way it grows. It leans into the sun. It is affected by the wind. Same with a river. A river just flows. It doesn't fight gravity. It works with it. And that's how Taoism is supposed to work. So this imbues Chinese culture with a great love of nature, a great love of natural forms. And that's why I love this object here. This is a gongshi, or a scholar's stone. This is a naturally occurring stone. This is a piece of black limestone that has just been weathered by erosion until it creates this thing that is valued as a work of art. And so a scholar would take a stone like this, put it on a beautiful base, and set it up in his study so that even while he's in his study, where everything is Confucian and everything is ordered, he has this little piece of nature, kind of like a miniature mountain. And gardens were created to be not geometrically perfect spaces like they were in like Islam or, say a French traditional garden, but they were meant to be replications of this natural order. So you could be there on your desk and you'd be writing in your calligraphy and you could see this stone and be reminded of the Tao. You could be reminded of this natural beauty. This very greatly impacts art as well. So you'll see a lot of artists, painters, sculptors, etc., impacted by Taoism, and Taoism figures very importantly in art. And then, of course, the last is Buddhism. So we've talked about Buddhism at length, but Buddhism seems a natural fit for China. So you already had this existing idea of accepting nothingness in Taoism, and Taoism and Buddhism blend kind of perfectly together. According to tradition, Buddhism is first introduced to China when the Emperor Ming requests that it's brought in the 1st century BCE. But it doesn't appear to be a major influence through most of the Han Dynasty. There are Buddhist shrines, etc., but traditional religions and Taoism are much more significant. By the 4th or 5th century, we're seeing a lot more of Buddhism come in. It comes overland by the Silk Road, and that brings in the styles of the Kushan and the Gandharan period. And you can see that the style here of this Tang lacquerware Buddha has the characteristics of that same period. It has naturalistic drapery in this case because this is an actual piece of cloth that's draped over a figure and then covered in lacquer so that it hardens. So you can see traits of Gandharan styles, of Guptan styles, of Mothra styles, all these styles get imported. Buddhism also comes into Tibet in the 8th and 9th century, and Tibetan Buddhism begins to influence Chinese Buddhism, particularly during the Yuan dynasty. The Yuan dynasty, the Yuan dynasty of the Mongols, Tibetan Buddhism becomes the state religion. But it doesn't become the majority religion until until the Han and later Han into the Sui and the Tang dynasty. But by the 9th century, it is. It's the predominant religion. But remember, Buddhism and Taoism are kind of universalist ideals, and so this doesn't mean the traditional ancestor worship or the traditional deities go away. They just become enlisted in the new tradition. And so just like in India, where the Vedic gods become appropriated into the Buddhist tradition and just become an entourage to the Buddha, the same thing happens for the Jade Emperor, Guan Yin, the Moon Goddess, all of these various important deities just get adopted into the Buddhist tradition, and Buddhism becomes this very, very influential idea that pervades through the rest of China, and it eventually becomes the heartland of Buddhism. So let's start talking about early Chinese culture. Some of the motifs that we will see in China are exceptionally old. Very, very old, in fact. We have a number of cultures from the Neolithic and Bronze Age that we don't have actual historical periods for, so we named them after the places that they were discovered. So, for example, you have the Hongshan culture, the Longzhou culture, etc. And we see some motifs that we will see again. One of the things that is prevalent in China is this love of jade. We've seen the love of jade in other cultures, particularly Mesoamerican cultures. Jade is an extremely hard stone. It's very shiny, it's very glossy, but it's hard to work. But it has this beautiful translucent quality. It comes in colors from pale pink all the way to dark green, but usually it's going to be green or yellowish green. And you can see in this pendant what's going to be one of the first ever representations of a cloud form, and you have this kind of swirling motif. We will see this motif pop up in ceramics, textiles, everything going on. So some of the oldest motifs are there from the very earliest Neolithic and Bronze Age. This is what we call a bee. A bee is a perforated jade disc, and they exist in all shapes and sizes. Some are just little pendant sized, some are, manhole cover sized. And this seems to be a representation, a kind of circular representation. It's been interpreted as a representation of the world, or a representation of life, or as eternity. Again, jade, because it's so green and it's so durable, is often interpreted as a kind of symbol of life. As we get into the Longzhou culture, we see really interesting objects called kongs. And these are mysterious objects because we do not know their intended meaning. We do not know what they were for. The only thing we can say about them is that they have roughly the same shape as a bee, so perhaps they are just simply bees that have been elaborated. They will have very kind of heavily stylized forms, but these are actually faces. You can actually see an eye, and a mouth. So these are incredibly stylized faces. They're usually small, they're about, 4 or 5 inches across. Again, these are carved from jade, so you have to hollow out the center of these and then carve them with tools that are not very hard. So this must have been just worn down. You must have taken like a pebble or a small bit of copper and then dipped it in emery and worn it down with the sand or the emery. And some of them are just one level, and others are multiple levels. So as you look at this one, you can see that each level here has these faces on the end, and in this case they've stacked them all up. And it gets slightly wider at the top than it is at the bottom. But there is in fact a hole that goes all the way through. All the way through the center of this thing. So the question is, what are these things? And the answer is we don't know. They are obviously some kind of ritual object. The faces are, the tattooee faces or ogre faces are probably meant to issue protection. We have a kind of vaguely square form inside a circular form, or a B, which kind of represents the universe or eternity in that way. They're made out of jade, which has associations with life and eternal life. And appropriately then, these things are found in funerary contexts. They are buried in tombs and graves. So it strongly suggests that that's what the meaning is. But other than that, we don't know. We also find pottery with polychrome decoration, going all the way back to the Neolithic and Bronze Age period with very, very simple decorations. So we have lots of very ancient cultures. Ceramics has a very old history in China. This one shows a kind of very simplified human figure, a strange creature that seems to have claws on its knees and other kind of interesting things, and a very strange face. Other patterns are more just seemingly decorative. Well, that brings us to the Shang period. The Shang period is the first period where we have an identifiable kind of ruling class, and it is settled within the Huang or Yellow River Valley system, which is right here, and this becomes the heartland of China. And its dates date from the late Bronze Age into right on the verge of the early Iron Age, but not quite on the Iron Age yet. And they're conquered by the Zhou, which is another ruling class which comes to power. Shang period is noted for its ceremonial bronzes. There's a whole series of these beautiful ceremonial bronze objects. This is a wine vase, and you can see that it has this elaborate kind of decoration. These are made as funerary objects. And it's really interesting because the everyday objects, the stuff they actually did use for drinking wine or, or storing liquids or cooking, they're usually made out of ceramics. They're made out of terracotta. And they're not anywhere near as elaborately decorated as these. So these are very clearly made for a funerary context. They are made to honor their dead, their ancestors, and because bronze is a very durable, a very wealthy material, the idea here is that this is going to carry on into the afterlife. It's a way of imparting permanence. You see ceremonial axe heads, and this is where we get into these ogre faces, these teotis. Teotis is a kind of ogre face that implies protection. It is kind of a guardian-like figure. And here you can see this is not ever intended to be used as a real axe. It was a ceremonial axe, never used. It was made purely for the deceased. But it has this wonderful perforated grin and eyeballs of this menacing kind of ogre or monster. You see this kind of stylized decoration everywhere. Here you can see another ogre face stylized in the decoration. This stuff looks almost pre-Columbian. It's so kind of geometric. Notice that we have these kind of cloud forms. It's kind of squared off, rounded spirals. This thing is a ding, and a ding is essentially a little barbecue. It's a little thing that you could put hot coals in, and then you could cook food on the ding. This one has this very elaborate cover. Again, usually these things are made in ceramics, but the fact that this was made in bronze shows that they wanted this to be long-lasting. One of the richest tombs found is the tomb of Fuhao. This is another one of these amazing Shang period tombs. And here you can see we have a variety of objects. We have a ding, which is kind of a walking barbecue. We have another kind of grill. We have pots, another ding. We have lanterns. We also have a chest, all made out of bronze. Now, these objects would have been made out of clay or made out of, wood, had they been made for everyday use. Notice also we have just an enormous number of these perforated jade discs, and also notice the red stain. This is cinnabar. Cinnabar is a mineral that has mercury in it, but it's this bright red blood-like color, also popularly used in the pre-Columbian era. And you just have to love the decoration on these things. This is a beautiful little three-legged ding, kind of smaller little barbecue. And here you can see these curled forms, these very stylized figures. But right in the center of it is this strange kind of ogre mask. Again, a figure of protection. A real ding wouldn't have been this elaborately decorated. These are clearly being made to protect ancestors and to protect their artifacts and to provide them with artifacts to use into the afterlife. It's during the Shang Dynasty that the first Chinese scripts are developed. And these Chinese scripts are first discovered on what's known as the oracle bones. So the tradition was to inscribe scripts onto these bones. This is a scapula from an ox. This is a shoulder bone. Then these bones would be placed in a fire, and then the fire would break the bones. And as the cracks moved across the patterns and the words, this would tell the person who was using it how to read the fortune of the individual that he was doing this for. So there's literally thousands of these bones that were burned, and then they were ultimately buried, which good for us because it gives us the first evidence of the Chinese writing system. And the Chinese writing system is an ideographic system. Every single emblem stands in for a unique, concise idea. The development of this writing system is much along the lines of other writing systems, and you can see how it becomes stylized over time. The sun is conceived as a circle with a dot in it. Eventually this gets simplified to a kind of rounded off circle with a line, and eventually becomes just, two boxes on top of each other. You can see how things like a pig starts off as a reasonable kind of simplified pictogram of a pig, but then eventually takes on a much more stylized form when they move from inscribing things. These are inscribed with an awl. When they move from inscribing these things with an awl to painting them with a brush by the time we develop the full script. So Chinese writing goes through a number of serious developments. It starts with these oracular bone scripts, these Shang period scripts from these ox bones, and then it develops into a bronze script. A bronze script is a script that was made during the Bronze Age and was meant to be incised on bronze, and then it develops into a seal script, and these were scripts that were carved into seal stones, and then eventually it develops into the traditional brush script. So you can see that it's a kind of incremental process. I love how a mountain starts as pretty much a drawing of a mountain, but then is just kind of reduced to 3 upright lines representing the mountain. There is another culture in China at this same time. So we've been looking mostly at the Yellow River, the Huang River area. This is the area for traditional ethnic Han Chinese. But far to the south, there is a whole other collection of people, and we know very little about them. We have no written history of them at all. We call this the Shu figures, and they are these tall, elongated, beautiful bronze figures with these highly stylized eyes and mouths. They're very elegant and very sophisticated. We find a number of these, and we know very, very precious little about them. Conceptually, these are bronze figures that have been gilt, so that you have these gold mask-like faces. But whatever happened to this culture, whether they were assimilated or died out, we don't know. And so it's important to know China's big. And the region that we think of as China today had a much more diverse series of cultures, and certainly those have either been assimilated or disappeared by the dominant culture that came out of the Yellow River area. And that brings us to the Zhou dynasty. So the Zhou or Chou dynasty, however you want to say this, there's various different ways you say this, depending on what dialect of Chinese you're using, and I'm certain I'm not saying them correctly because I am a lazy American and it's very hard to get this right. But the Zhou dynasty is this period that transitions us from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age. And it's where most of the final culture of what we call China. This is where we move from the kind of mytho-historical period of China, where the history is mostly mythology, but a little bit of accurate, to a period that's actually mostly history. This is where we have the spring and autumn periods, which define Confucianism and this idea of the mandate of heaven, and ultimately kind of ends in the Warring States period. And it's this chaos that emerges from the collapse of the Zhou that allows the Qing dynasty, the first imperial dynasty, to form. Zhou period is very, very similar to the Shang in that we have many of the similar ideas of bronzes being used and created for funerary purposes. So here we have a variety of Shang vessels, including a ceremonial bell and 2 wine vessels. Notice that we still have these rather stylized patterns, but we have the emergence of dragons and perhaps a more deliberately narrative style. They have these kind of ogre or monster masks on them as well, but they're very, very stylized. Here we have an incense burner. I love this incense burner. Notice that it has the cloud form on it, so a kind of squared off but rounded spiral. It's a very, very old form. And this has lugs, so you can attach it to cords. What I love about this is that it has a lid over the top of it, but the lid can be taken off and can function as a separate sensor. So down here you would put hot coals, and then you would sprinkle incense on top of this to fumigate a room. Here is a Zhou period guang, or a ritual vessel. In this case, the ritual vessel has many of the same ideas that shared with the Shang period: stylized cloud forms, stylized faces. Here we have the ram, but the ram has a kind of stylized animal head in between it. Beautiful objects. It's also during the Zhou period that we start to have our first true, really beautiful jade objects. So this is probably a kind of scepter of some kind, and you can see that it has a bird, but within the bird and other forms we see these spiral forms. Here is a jade pendant carved into the shape of a dragon. You have this beautiful, wonderful kind of motion to it. It has this twisted kind of pattern of grooves as if it's made out of rope, but it has this wonderfully dynamic face and a small hole to carry it. It is at this time that we also see the first evidence of painting on silk. Paper hadn't been invented yet, but we do see sericulture. Sericulture is the creation of silk, and we start to see figures. And this gives us our first sense of what Chinese painting and scholastic painting is going to be like. Here we see a man standing, and he is riding on the back of an incredibly stylized dragon. The dragon looks very much like the decorations on this vase in a way. And so you can see this. He's wearing these long flowing robes, and this shows you just how long-lasting Chinese culture really is. We will see these kind of robes and these kind of structures and decorations later on Tang period scrolls. I'm going to stop and talk a great deal about Tang period painting when we get there and talk a little bit more about it. But it's important to know that this rich tradition of Chinese scholastic painting, the high point of which is probably the 6th through the 10th century and onward, really does have a very, very old tradition. It's just that silk doesn't survive. Silk tends to erode and fall apart. This only survived because it was buried in a tomb and miraculously survived under perfect conditions. But it shows that this thin calligraphic style of ink washes really has a very, very long provenance in Chinese civilization. So when we see these fully formed, beautiful ink wash hanging scrolls and hand scrolls in the Su and the Jin and the Tang dynasty, it's not like they popped out of nowhere. They were obviously doing stuff like this for a very long time, but very, very little of it actually survives. So this brings us to the Qin dynasty. So the Qin dynasty is founded when this character by the name of Ying Zhang conquers all of these warring states and unifies them together into a single multi-state. And he actually gives himself a new name. Kings before this time, styled themselves as kings, as rulers. But he actually creates this new title, the Qingshi Huangdi, which is where we get this idea of emperor, emperor of all of China. And from this time on, we will have this idea that if there isn't an emperor, at least there should be an emperor. There's, again, periods of disunity, civil war, etc. that exist in China. But from this time on, we will see an attempt at a unified China, this ethnic Han ideal. He is going to have a civil service and a centralized state, but he persecutes the Confucian scholars. In fact, in 2013 BCE, he actually burns all of the Confucian works. If you've ever read the works of Ray Bradbury, and you've ever come across Fahrenheit 451, Ray Bradbury was a great lover of Chinese mythology and history, and he wrote Fahrenheit 451, the premise of which is that people are burning books, and so what they decide to do is everybody agrees to remember one book, so that, it's too much to remember all the lost books, but if everybody can remember one, then we will share all those books, and we will preserve these books into the future. And that's actually what happened. When these Confucian scholars were having all of their books destroyed by Emperor Qin, they actually memorized the Analects and the works of Confucius, so that when this day of persecution passed, they could go and put them all back down again. So Fahrenheit 451 is just a modern retelling of this historical event. Now again, the reason he persecuted Confucian scholars is because Confucian scholars were very much about ethics. They were very much about this idea that, a ruler does not just get carte blanche. He does not get to do what he wants to do. He has to live by this social contract, this paternalistic patriarchal order. He was also known as a very militaristic ruler, and kind of a brutal dictator in a way for being the first emperor, a very ruthless figure. But he's also the person who's responsible for the beginning of the construction of the Great Wall, which defines historically the ancient boundaries of China. He builds a colossal tomb to himself, and this colossal tomb eventually is a kind of tumulus or pyramid-shaped mountain. Here you can see, over here, a kind of reconstruction of his tomb, but away from his tomb to I believe it's the west, but don't quote me on that, there were a series of pits. Now, it is in these pits that we found the miraculous discovery of the terracotta army. So Qin was something of a megalomaniac, so not only did he have this fabulous tomb built, this incredible structure built, but he also had this huge pit created, and in the pit were over 8,000 soldiers. Now this was something that was recorded in history, that he made this vast army of terracotta figures. But no one actually believed it. Everybody thought it was this grotesque exaggeration. And it wasn't until 1974 that they stumbled across it and discovered it. And boy, was it absolutely gobsmacking. Here you can see the terracotta soldiers. You can see that some have been restored. Some are mostly destroyed. And in fact, the weight of the earth over the centuries had crushed most of them. but some of them were preserved, and some of them have been painstakingly recreated. It has been said that every single head is unique, and that they were modeled after his own army. That's not actually true. A recent study has discovered that there's about that the heads of the generals and the high-ranking officers seem to have been modeled and sculpted individually, but the vast majority of the soldiers have standardized heads, but there's like 12 different kind of standardized heads, and then what they did is they mixed and matched headgear and clothing gear so that if you take 12 and you mix and match the various headgears, this gives you an even greater variety. So they were conscientiously aware that, oh, okay, well, we want them to make them look unique, but this is too hard to do, so what we'll do is we'll make about 12 standard heads, and we'll mix and match the headgear and the mustaches and everything else to create more variety. They're absolute marvels because you can see that the lamellar armor with the cording to hold together the pauldrons and the rivets to hold together pieces are all there. They were originally painted, and they're organized as they would have been in the military, with archers, infantrymen, charioteers. Even the chariots and the horses themselves were preserved. Stylistically, they're an interesting mix of stylization and naturalism. In many cases, the drapery is not so believable, but the figures all have a kind of unique life and vitality to them. So it shows that you have this incredible sense of the body or of the figure. But again, mostly these are meant to be simulacra. You are an emperor. You are going to be this great ancestor to your future generations. And so what's going to happen is you're going to pass into the afterlife. You want to be accompanied by your entire entourage, including your entire army. So you make your army as a stand-in so that it can pass with you. Now, according to tradition, his tomb was built under the mound, and it was built over a gigantic map of China itself. And that the map of China actually had whole villages and towns. So here's a couple of hypothetical, rather fanciful reconstructions of what this might have looked like. His tomb was in the center, and according to tradition, his tomb was in the center in a lake. Here it's depicted as if it's on a dragon boat, and this is his sarcophagus here. But what you're seeing here is the town, and the town was actually made... The village in the map of China was actually made out of precious stones. So, you know, the landscape, the green of the landscape would have been made out of jade. The villages were made out of precious materials, gold and silver. And the rivers, even the rivers, were supposed to be made out of mercury, so that they flowed in silver, so that they had the quality of being liquid, and they would flow, but they were made out of mercury so that they would be permanent. Lot to go to for a toxic map. Now again, this has never been discovered, but hey, no one thought these terracotta soldiers were real. Everybody thought that was kind of a myth. So the suspicion is that maybe this is there somewhere. Maybe this beautiful jade map is waiting. This map made out of jade, rivers and mercury, and his actual tomb. Maybe it's waiting for somebody to discover in some undiscovered chamber. I don't know. Maybe they'll make a Lara Croft Tomb Raider movie out of it. That would be fun. So the Qin dynasty is also famous for creating the Great Wall. China, again, is very lush and green down here in this region, and so this is the heartland. This is agriculture is the source of the incredible wealth of China. It's why it has such a great population. But to the north is a vast area of mountainous plains, and these are filled with nomads. This border here is the modern-day state of Mongolia, which at various times had been conquered by China, but we won't talk about that at the moment. We'll wait till we get to the Mongols. And so these nomads are herdsmen, but they grow up in the saddle of a horse, and so they're also very noted horse raiders. They're also noted for archery. They could shoot bows right out of the back of the horse. So this is a perpetual problem, that you had these central steppe nomads who would raid down into China, because China is where all the money was and the food, and then they would go back. And so the Great Wall of China was constructed as a fortification to prevent them from having easy access. Now, when we look at the Great Wall of China, this is what we see. But most of this dates from the Ming period. Most of this comes from the much later period of the 13th, 14th, and 15th century. But the original wall, parts of the original wall are still there. And so we see the very romantic vision of the wall that looks like this, but this is not what it would have looked like. But remnants of the Qin period Great Wall are still there, and most of what is the Great Wall today is in a state of ruin. Okay, well, I've already gone an hour and 5 minutes, and I haven't even gotten to the Han Dynasty. But rather than try to introduce the Han Dynasty here, I think what we'll do is pause, and we'll save that for the next lecture. So we'll come back and talk about the Han Dynasty in the next lecture, which hopefully will go up later today. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.